Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our final Reformed Church Center program for this academic year, and providentially our second Pop and Young lecture that happens during this academic year because the Pop and Young lecture for last year got postponed into last fall. And so we've gotten the treat of two gifted worship lecturers in 1 year. Tonight's program is Now the Silence, Now the Peace, how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the work of church musicians. I have to say that when we were looking at fellowship proposals last April, we thought that this would all be past tense information. The plan was, oh yeah, the pandemic's going to be over, and by spring term, we're going to be back to a little bit more normal. And well, so much for the plan, but we are glad to be able to be here with you this way. We are very glad to be able to have Justan Foster, who is our 2020-2021 Pop and Young Fellow in Reformed Worship. Justan is music director at the Greenbush Reformed Church in East Greenbush, New York. He has served as dean of both the Hudson, Catskill, and Eastern New York chapters of the American Guild of Organists, and he specializes in the organ works of American composers. In addition to his musical and liturgical pursuits, Justan serves as a senior administrative analyst for the state of New York, and just completed a graduate degree at SUNY Albany, I think. He'll tell us all if I was just wrong about that.
At Albany Law School, but thank you.
Albany Law School, but I was close.
Very close.
So now, certainly without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Justan Foster.
Thank you so much, James. What I would like to say, just to give everybody kind of a brief overview, is just a little bit about myself before I get into this. I've been properly introduced by James, and I certainly appreciate that. But just to give you some context around this, I am a music director. My wife is a minister, and that's, to put it mildly, for both of us. And throughout the pandemic, at any given point, we've been either leading or supervising or assisting in worship services for 4, if not 5, different Reformed churches at any given point. It doesn't make us experts, it simply makes us exhausted. But it's something where we've been able to take most of our experiences from what it is that we've been able to do, and really start to flesh out ways in which COVID has impacted churches, and specifically the way that worship is done and the way that congregations are able to connect with one another. So part of that comes from this. But it's certainly much smaller, and part of this presentation includes the results of a survey that was done by myself to kind of confirm some of my theories and some of my concerns, and that is certainly appreciated from those that were a part of that. So I do want to say a special thanks to James Brum for having the opportunity to be here this evening. I also want to give particular thanks to Laura Russell and Sarah Bariza, who have been instrumental in helping me to pose some of these questions and to be ears willing to listen to whatever theories I've come up with. And a special thank you to my wife, Paige Convis, who is not able to be here this evening, but trust me, she's heard it. And I give her thanks for being somebody that's willing to do that. So with that said, let's get into this presentation, and please feel free to ask questions at the conclusion and take notes throughout it. There's no exam, but it's helpful to have that as part of that. So first, what does a sacred musician do? This is a question that is very expansive, but it's something that kind of helps us to set the scene and set the context for what it is that we're talking about. Now, very loosely, a sacred musician generally plays an instrument or sings, leads a choir or congregation in worship, maybe not all the time, maybe part of the time, maybe in different ways, and they help to fulfill ritual requirements and impart new traditions. This is a very base level understanding of what a sacred musician does. A more perfunctory explanation of what a sacred musician does comes from Kathleen Harmon, who wrote in The Ministry of Music this idea of a hierarchy of function. And I will preface this by saying this is coming from a Catholic tradition, so it's quite stark. It's quite stark. The first part is the musician is in charge of music which is the right, meaning music which is specifically required in acts of the Mass or in the acts of worship. Examples of that are the Gloria, the Sanctus, the Memorial Acclamation. Second, their second priority is music which accompanies the rite, such as hymns or anthems or what's known as traveling music. As there's some kind of liturgical action that is happening, you are helping to aid in that particular understanding or interpretation. You're also just kind of getting rid of silence. Sometimes silence is wonderful, sometimes it's just awkward. And finally, the third component of that is music which is optional. Music that happens outside of what is considered the actual worship service, or music that's not necessarily required to move the service forward, but it is there. Now, obviously, this is a very stark interpretation of that. So let's flesh out from that just a little bit. The first way that we're going to do that is take a look at the specific challenges of music ministry. We've all heard what's called the worship wars. And what I've done is kind of divide this into two different wars that are here. So worship war 1, happening after David the psalmist, we have 3 main points. One is that we are consistently commanded within the Bible to make praise with music. You can take a look at almost any psalm and find some example of that being there, as well as other books of the Bible. We also see one of the first documented incidences of someone who is in authority when it comes to worship or to scriptural understanding, having some type of disagreement with musicians. It's not new. It's something that's well established. I highly recommend one of the books that I have worked at this evening is called The Guide for Music Ministers, and we'll talk about it shortly, but it's by Jennifer Kerr Breedlove and Paul Turner. And if you buy it for nothing but the preface, I highly recommend you do so. Their account of Jesus going to the girl who is believed to be sick or to be dead and being constantly irritated by flautists is a telling that should make it into more sermons, I feel. So it's something to pay attention to. And then there's also another component where biblically, there seems to be no end in sight to what music will be within acts of worship. And that goes right through the book of Revelation, where we see the return of Christ, and we see that we are also working with an environment in the heavens where there are, the choir of 10,000 is singing and the saints are calling out. So it doesn't look like as if music is going away at any point. It's something that's here to stay in acts of worship. Now, the second phase of this, Worship War 2, really starts from that Reformation, or just shy of Reformation period, through to where we have coronavirus start to make its way. And part of that comes out of misunderstanding. Part of that comes out of a return to simpler approaches to things. So one thing that you can take from this is that when the Reformation came about, one of the fueling attributes of the Reformation was at that time in the Catholic Church, music was not accessible. Until the arrival of Palestrina, you had music that was going into 6 and 8 parts. It was being sung in a language that most people within the Catholic Church may not speak as their primary language. It was difficult to understand. They were not necessarily educated in music. And they went from being participants in a worship service to being spectators or observers. And it was a passive action. It was not something that was accessible. And one of the first things that the Reformation did, specifically with Martin Luther, was start to bring back what's known as Ambrosian chant, which is a much more simpler approach to worship in the way it's done. One of the hymns that you'll find, one of the earliest hymns or German chorales that you'll find is Nun kommt in Heiden Heiland, Savior of the Nations Come. It's still in most hymnals these days, and there's been wonderful adaptations of it. But the goal of it was it got everybody moving in the same direction. It was also at the time sung in German. It fit the vernacular. There was all of a sudden a connection to something that was accessible. And the phrase that Henry Brunsma came away with is that essentially that Catholics sang their way into Protestantism. So it's something where you really want to look at the impact of music on understanding the Reformation. And then the Reformation sort of takes this other turn that starts those worship wars between clergy, musicians, and congregations. And one of those examples is John Calvin. And to be fair, I will say that John Calvin, I think, gets a bad rap. Henry Brunsma also does extensive research on understanding how Calvin got to where Calvin became so obsessed with not having organs or things that were not necessarily the psalters being involved in worship. And it involves arriving in stark environments and then expanding that experience and seeing things that were not as stark. And it was a challenge. We didn't do well with change, and musicians ended up in a situation where they were between the clergy, between the state church, and between the politicians. And so that's where you really start to get that argument over the role of music and the way in which people will be engaged. And lastly, through this challenge is really understanding the types of music that are used. The word contemporary is something that it's been used as a way in which to other music. And to say that it's something that gets attached to whatever is not currently done and used in a way that sort of lessens the impact of that. By calling music contemporary, right, we're saying it doesn't match what we're used to, and the connotation is a negative one. An example of that in 1920s, 1930s, the idea of singing spiritual hymns, whether they were white or black spirituals, was significantly reduced or looked down upon or viewed as lesser compared to the hymn traditions. Obviously today that's not the case, but we may look at other musical traditions. I know for the longest time, things like Hillsong or music that came out of the late 80s, early 90s was certainly looked down upon. And today it's a little bit more mainstream in certain types of blended worship. There's also the idea of what is sacred. We go back to Martin Luther, and one of the first few things that were done, the tunes that were coming out, were certainly not considered sacred. They were used in bars. They were used as folk tunes, and then the words were simply changed. So this idea of profane versus sacred, or the profane becoming sacred or becoming utilized in worship, is also a controversy that kind of works through these challenges. So these are just some things to keep in mind as we're going through that. A better idea of trying to define what a sacred musician does, this goes back to Breedlove and Turner. They have a quote in here that specifically talks about those flautists that we mentioned earlier. That says, basically, as a music minister, you're offering a gift to the glory of God. You are no faithless flute player staring at the dead as at just another job. You are filled with faith, a faith that saves. You are filled with life, filled with song, and filled with discipleship. Where Jesus leads, you will follow. You will play and sing what fits the occasion. You will lead others to Christ. Within the Mass, the music serves a variety of needs. It gathers the voice of the assembly into one. It accompanies processions. It invites people to listen. It colors and drives the drama of worship. Whether you sing or play, your ministry is essential to the worship of your parish. Your skill will disclose your faith. Your faith will attract the faith of others. God will be praised. And I think that that's a slightly more helpful understanding and framing for what a sacred musician does, but we will expand on that as we get into this. So let's talk about music ministry in a pandemic. Basically, everything that we just discussed was upended by 3 repeating questions for most musicians. What do I do now? Is this appropriate for now? How am I supposed to do that now? Everything was done in a way where it didn't matter what was done before. All of a sudden, everything changed. So being able to fulfill those rituals and retain some form of tradition without doing everything completely different was really, really complicated. And the problem with that is that you, as a music minister, and I will admit this as a music director, part of that is you get to this point where you're so busy reacting that you're not actually leading. You're not doing your job as a music director or necessarily as a sacred musician. But you're trying to hold all of that angst, all of that concern between what it is that you're used to doing and what it is that everybody expects you to do and the reality of what you're able to do. It's not a fun place to be, and it caused a number of issues. Victoria Sirota wrote that our best musicians are mystics. The mystic seeks union with God beyond the intellectual and human experience. The process of giving birth to any creative idea may be a stormy one because the artist walks between 2 worlds, carrying messages from one side to another. I can think of no better way to really try and facilitate the experience of musicians throughout this than to say musicians have been walking a fine line between two worlds. And I think part of that is, part of that is spiritual, and part of that is also health related, and trying to navigate everybody's anxiety at once. And I don't think this is exclusive necessarily to sacred musicians, but it's certainly more complicated and more emotional. So with that, we kind of get to the title of why I titled this presentation, Now the Silence, Now the Peace. So I'd like to play a quick recording that I made, and I apologize in advance. There's a reason that they put me on the organ bench and not make me a soloist, but so that you have an idea of what this song is, and then we can discuss it a little bit and how it relates to this.
Now the silence, now the peace, now the empty hands uplifted, now the kneeling, now the plea, now the Father's arms in welcome, now the hearing, now the power, now the vessel brimmed for pouring, now the body, now the blood, now the joyful celebration, now the wedding, now the songs, now the heart forgiven leaping, now the Spirit's visitation, now the Son's epiphany, now the Father's blessing, now.
So that song is somewhat familiar, somewhat unfamiliar. Some of you may have just heard it for the first time. Some of you know it as a golden oldie. But it's something where there's a bunch of things that are going on at the same time. The composer wrote that really the basis for this was coming out of the fact that we expect so little out of worship. And this is kind of a hymn that basically packs everything into it that it possibly can, discussing grace, discussing epiphany, discussing the experiences of ourselves in acts of worship, in corporate acts and in individual acts of worship, and the way in which that's all united around, core concepts, core sacraments within our faith, and that's really where this kind of energy comes from, and what we can expect out of worship, and not necessarily as a presentation value, not necessarily as something that we expect to receive some type of miracle out of it, but the expectation of that connection, the expectation of that ability to find that grace on a repeating plane that is out there in a way that's actually going to grow our faith and to improve the lives and the experiences within our communities. The text from the hymnal that I took it out notes that this hymn lacks punctuation, it lacks rhyme, it has bar lines all over the place, it seems random, but it's something that is cultivated to create careful patterns that combine to wake into memory and to evoke a strong sense of God's presence. It's both familiar and unfamiliar all at the same time, which you could argue is probably the best form of worship. It comforts the afflicted and it afflicts the comforted. And so I think that's part of where this comes out of, and really that's been our experience thus far, at least as a sacred musician during COVID. Michael Hahn had a few musings about this hymn as well that kind of add on to this. One is the fact that now appears 16 times in it. It's not talking about then, it's not talking about coming in the future, it's not talking about all of these things that are disconnected. It's talking about our experience, our worship, our understanding of grace is something that is happening now at this very time. It's not something that is distant, it's not something that is disconnected. And that music is part of making that connection. Michael also notes that it begins on an unstable chord, and you'll notice that it ends on an unstable chord. And part of that is the composer originally had said it comes on the same tone that starts the Sursum Corda. That is what you begin the Great Thanksgiving prayer immediately after this and go into that act of Eucharist. It's a sense of arrival. It's a sense of preparation. It's a sense of inviting those who are worshiping to be prepared to question, to sit there and to think, what next? And that's another part of worship. At the end of worship, I don't think anybody leaves worship having all of the answers. I don't think that anybody leaves expecting to know exactly what happens next. Our jobs beyond that worship space is to figure that out. And musicians are to help people to get to that point of saying, okay, what now? And that's really part of our role in that process. So if we're talking about what a sacred musician does and everything's been flipped upside down and we feel like we're caught in some type of whirlwind, what do? Well, we're going to live into that whirlwind. We're going to figure out what that means and take advantage of this opportunity. One author that I enjoy, who is certainly not religious in most conventional senses and is certainly focused on something that is technical and analytical, is Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who wrote a series of books, including The Black Swan and not the one that you're all familiar with, but also a book called Anti-Fragile, Things That Gain from Disorder. Taleb writes, wind extinguishes a candle and energizes fire. Likewise, with randomness, uncertainty, chaos, you want to use them, not hide from them. You want to be the fire and wish for the wind. And I think sacred musicians really, that's our core. We want to be that fire and wish for the wind, but I think we're more than wishing for it. That is an expectation that comes out of the worship, is that wind will be there, that divine presence will be there to assist in guiding whatever it is that we have done and the way in which that we have prepared things, no matter the circumstances. So our role in this whirlwind is really to lead people in responses of thanksgiving and lament and celebration, and to do so authentically. And I think that the word authentic is really pivotal. I know in any recording, anything that I've done throughout this with my choir is to really focus on being authentic. That doesn't mean that we don't do things well. It doesn't mean that we don't go back and maybe retake something if that's the case, but it means that we allow that space for that imperfection we might normally not settle for, or we allow that space for somebody to not necessarily just adjust everything and ignore everything that's going on, to be completely present in this because it's speaking to a much larger experience. And I think we want to be cognizant of that. We can't act like as if nothing's happening, but at the same time, we can still meet some type of standard. So authentic was the key word for what it was that we were focusing on. And in my research, I found there's a book that actually just came out this year called Becoming What We Sing by David Lemley. And David writes, worship is a response to the grace of God already received. The symbols of worship invite a rehearsal of the not yet coming reality of God's kingdom. Full participation, holding the authentic experience of the worshiping community together with the self-communication of God, brings the tension between the old and new age into focus. Through authentic participation, the saving work of God is not theoretically symbolized, but concretely expressed in the lives of worshipers. We are working on something that is a response to grace, and it is something that is bringing all those things that are promised, all those things that have been foretold to this now space. It's not something where it's that theoretical world. And I think that is something that really came to life and became evident for sacred musicians during a pandemic. So what did that look like? Well, we have a few examples for you. Some that made the news was, in the United Kingdom, as we had COVID vaccinations that were underway in Salisbury Cathedral, they were playing the organ while people were waiting in line. That was something that was certainly well circulated. Something else that was slightly less circulated was at the Plymouth UCC Church out in Nebraska, where Tom Trenny is the music director. There are two things that happen here. One, all of a sudden, all of the music plans for the year, for the program year, went out of the window. Tom Trenny has already published a book of hymn arrangements that he basically wrote in the days and first few weeks of COVID being something that required all of these shutdowns, that basically took these hymns and took familiar hymns and jazzed them up, for lack of a better word at this point, in such a way that people were able to experience something that was familiar. And those compositions have been published already. And Tom has a really wonderful introduction to explain the circumstances of it. But then he also has an individual within his church who is responsible for posting all of the music. And during those first few days and weeks of shutdowns, they were posting, a few hymns of whatever it was that they had recorded the week before. And then they noticed that they received a number of comments about, how wonderful this is, how much of an outreach it is. They miss music. They want to be back to it. And so Tom Trenny, as well as his librarian, went through and found old recordings that had never been put up, but they were kept as archives, and just started putting all of that music up for people to be able to access remotely during these shutdowns. And it was something where by doing that, they were meeting a need. They were making something slightly more accessible. They were trying to fill some kind of thing in a way that was the missional example of being able to meet people where they were. We have one short video clip to kind of give you an idea of our personal experiences through all of this. And I will say one thing that we had done out of Greenbush Reformed Church is there was going to be no Memorial Day parade. And those who might need the slides afterwards, there's a link to it. But so we had put together a 30-minute concert for organ, as well as with a trumpeter who recorded remotely. And we did pieces that either had local composers that tied into a larger theme, or had some kind of local tie to it all, and offered that as a type of community parade. And it was very well received, but it's something where we basically met a crowd of people that the only time that they'd ever be at our church is waiting for the parade to go by. Since there was no parade, this was part of it. And then the town of East Greenbush actually started making its own digital parade where they had people that were contributing to this. So the concert became part of a series. It kicked off a series of things within the town to try and start to do something along these lines to give people something that they would be able to express or find accessible. You'll notice that there's at least one photo in this clip that comes up where you can see what happens when you record a concert remotely and give somebody the ability to Photoshop things. It's the most ecumenical concert shot you will see, where all three major faith traditions are represented in one photo. You have to keep an eye on it. So let's go and roll that B-roll footage. So it gives you kind of an idea of some of the things that we have experienced in our own ministry up here in the Rensselaer County area. And so from that, it really came about that we wanted to get into the survey, which I will not try to bore you with most of the details that were here, but just notice a few trends. The survey had about 100 participants that came from the United States, Canada, and even Ireland. I actually had to double check the postal code. I was afraid that somebody had made a typo, but they were definitely from Ireland. We noticed that those that were responding were filling 2 or more roles at 45% of those. 16% were 3 or more roles. We had about 15 different denominations that were represented, and about 6% of the individuals that responded were working for multiple institutions throughout COVID, which helped to get an idea of things. To give you an overview of this, about 2/3 of the respondents were from within the Reformed formulary, being UCC, RCA, PCUSA, and ELCA. So it gives you kind of an idea where this was coming from and the way that this was going to be represented. Those that were responding were asked the type of worship styles that they were in there. Now, what's interesting is that this was the response ratio, which seems about right. But we did actually provide contemporary as an option. So that's part of my theory of the worship wars are over. Nobody's going to call anything contemporary anymore. That or anybody who's strictly doing things that are contemporary and wants it to see that way didn't want to take part in this survey. Most of those responding were music directors, and it's important to note that individuals could be filling, as we mentioned, more than one role. So somebody could be a music director and an organist, or somebody who is a soloist and an instrumentalist throughout this. Getting into some specifics about this, you'll see that the overwhelming response for ways in which services were modified were to go to virtual live services. Virtual recorded services were not necessarily as prominent. Part of that, I believe, is just the need to be accessible and be consistent and make sure that people are able to be engaged at the same time, I think was of importance to most people. You'll notice that the reduced attendance is the second part of that, which probably ties into the live virtual services that were there. But it was interesting to see that trend come down. Also, when you look at the changes that were done by denomination, you'll notice that things like, so the virtual live service was very prominent among those that were in the Reformed formulary. You will notice that reduced attendance is something that was maybe more common in Baptist or Methodist lines. But it gives you an idea of really where people were coming from this particular experience. And the way in which it's done. And anybody who's trying to read this, what you're looking at is this is a percentage of the entirety of it, and showing the breakdown of what those decisions were in that denomination with regards to the modification. So anybody who wants to see these in detail is certainly welcome to afterwards. And then we had asked a question about what was your biggest crisis in anything that you're experiencing. The overwhelming crisis response was technology, which we expected, followed by what defining musical leadership looked like. But then you'll notice trends within denomination. The denomination that was most concerned with health requirements were those who were Episcopalian, followed closely by those who were in the Reformed, the RCA. But you'll notice different things that are here that are present. Most of those come out when you start to get into the crisis by title. And you see that music directors were most frustrated with the engaging technology and what musical leadership looks like. But then you maybe had that flip when you were looking at choir members who were more concerned about the health requirements that were there. So it's helpful to get an idea of where those concerns were coming from and how they were playing out. We also asked about the types of technology that were engaged when it came to worship. It looks like, most people were engaging recording equipment for the first time or virtual meeting spaces. One curious note is that nobody was using short-range radio transmitter before COVID at all. It was something that certainly came out of this process, at least those that were being engaged. Moving along, we asked 3 big questions about this. One is what challenges that you encountered enhanced or taught you a skill? So one of these was about being recorded. All of a sudden, there was a self-awareness of how you're doing things, how you're saying things, how you sound. You should practice more. The gaps in understanding technology or trying to figure out who's supposed to be responsible for it. as well as a reliance on others to have things done in a timely fashion or to do things well enough that these are things that are being captured. We also had concerns with boundaries about whose job something was supposed to be, whether or not you were working in a time frame. Is this actually expected of my job description? And one curious note that did come out of this that I admit that I forgot to put into the slide was the boundary around what was acceptable and unacceptable for people in their working environments. So it could be something where the church is requiring, clergy or musician to still do in-person worships when both of those individuals were in a higher risk category, or, instances where there were stories of people, depending on their geographic location, where it was expected that the choir would still happen, and not having the choir was a violation, and it was something where individuals would be dismissed or would be threatened with that. I know a number of institutions in our area that were specifically Catholic essentially fired their musician the minute that the shutdown happened because they thought they would have no money coming in. They didn't know what was going to happen. The musician wouldn't be working. So therefore, all of a sudden there were a number of people that were simply terminated. So there was a real mixed signal about the value of worship and music that came out of that. We also had individuals that were trying to figure out what a want versus a need was. Wants, we want to sing, we want to gather, we want to do new things, new music, new rituals, or I should say new experiences. But the reality is that the need was that we needed to be able to communicate. We needed to feed those relationships and have the ability to learn from one another. And really being able to translate that, I think, was pivotal for a number of people that had responded to this. And then this point, not to confuse you, is not about worship services, but about worship and leading worship as a type of service. Sacred musicians are providing something that many others do not. It's not that they're not capable of it, but maybe they don't do it on a routine basis or they're not familiar with it. There are musicians that all of a sudden their skills went dark and they noticed that once they started doing things again, it was kind of like riding a bike. You had to get things back. You started to lose skills. You started to lose track of things that were being done. It's very real and not really foreign to most. And also that institutions, there was a very limited succession plan. You had a number of individuals who retired from their positions or left or moved or perhaps passed away. And the idea of who was going to take the reins for that particular part of a worship program or within church staffing was often left into the wind. And many people were kind of dealing with things as they happened. Which is a repeating story, but it means that this is something that, and I think this goes for clergy too, not necessarily as a succession planning, but having an idea of what it looks like if somebody is not there, if somebody's not involved, if somebody's not able to fulfill that. And many institutions were not prepared for that particular experience. One of the other questions that were asked was about whether or not there were challenges that were least enjoyed, and this is kind of predictable. The loss of group singing was the top response. A sudden change in the quality or accessibility of the services or of the music, all of a sudden you had two things that happened at the same time. You had people that were no longer able to be there in person, needed that type of connection. That's what they experienced. But you also had people that had been homebound. And in Greenbush's case, we had individuals that had been homebound for a decade that the most they were getting was maybe a recording of the sermon, maybe the bulletin in the mail and a visit. But now all of a sudden, in their nursing home, they could watch all the services each week because we were now providing them online. So it's a double-edged sword when it comes to that. And that feeds into the technology-related issues between both cost and navigation and figuring out if you needed to hire somebody else to do things. And then the lack of communication, which comes back to those boundaries. Who's responsible for what? I'm not actually finding out until the last minute that this has been asked or requested. We also asked a question about what was discovered or rediscovered. And this is not to be cliche, but some things of this are predictable. One is that music is something that was considered life-sustaining, or it speaks and fills those gaps and helped many people that were trying to navigate something they had never experienced. The importance of being intentional in everything that is done, whether it's programming or whether it's just maintaining your relationships and being honest and forthright and committed and actually backing up what it is that is needed, what is said, and responding in ways that are going to be respectful and helpful. And also that pastoral relationships come first, the need to check in on individuals. One comment that came out of this survey that was of interest was that our roles help people to gather and that need never stopped. And that is something that really sticks out to me as a sacred musician. That requirement never dropped off of the map throughout all of COVID. And music is something that it was a signal that we were going to start. It was a signal that we were done. It was a signal of this is a portion of the service, and that was still needed. And all of a sudden you had silence in these spaces, and you had that need not being met in at least a way that was familiar or a way that was expected for days or weeks or even months for some congregations. But that is something that really stuck with me. So the three main points that I'd like any sacred musician or really any clergy to take away from this are that worship is an emotional experience for everyone involved, whether they admit it or not. They have memories, they are either participatory or they observe it, they're used to that. And so when that is taken away, it heightens that anxiety. It's a significant change that is there. We also have an issue where we need to create accessible experiences in order for individuals and groups to be able to survive, whether it's as a church, whether it's as an organization, as a choir, something along those lines needs to exist. And I think that goes right back to the changes in music in the Reformation. Worship became inaccessible, music became inaccessible, and people kind of voted with their feet as far as the way in which they responded to that. So that is important. And the last point out of that is that our mission is to serve as a witness to the presence of God in this place now and always. We go back to now the silence, now the peace. It's not something where this happened then, this is happening tomorrow. Now this is happening. This is where we need to serve as the witness, whether it is making phone calls, doing weird events that you never thought you would be doing and putting recitals together, or showing up to sing outside of a nursing home. These are things that were important and were part of that witness. And I just want to close with one quick, I'll call it the parable of the ecumenical chapel. Victoria Sirota, who we discussed earlier, talks about when she was completing her time at seminary, her assignment was to work with the chapel at the hospital nearest. And you had a bunch of people, a bunch of seminarians that were part of this, that were all from different traditions and were at, a seminary that was not necessarily allegiant or associated with any particular denomination. So you had many different backgrounds, and they were all charged with leading the chapel service on a daily basis. And they all started off with this experience of wanting to do things their way, in their tradition, how they would like it. And usually what happened is each day they did that, and everybody else that was in that group was either alienated by it, didn't understand it, or wasn't particularly impressed with it. And it just became this bit of who was going to be upset each day. And Victoria goes on to say that at the end of this process, after many weeks and months, they started to adjust their approach. And what she writes is, we were learning to accept the fact that none of us had all the answers, but together as a group, it seemed as though we had some of them. In short, we had become a congregation. And I think if sacred musicians can take anything away from this, along with clergy, along with congregants, it is that nobody in this situation has had or still has or will probably ever have all the answers, whether it's a pandemic or not. But by recognizing that some people have some answers and that all of us together are getting closer to some of those answers, we're able to be much more effective sacred musicians and much more effective at what it is that we are trying to do. And that's really the if you take nothing else from this, that's where I've arrived at. And so with that, I will turn this back over to James and to Amanda to take questions and to work from this. Thank you.
Well, you're just going to get James, but that's okay. This is the time, folks, when you should start raising your virtual hands. If you raise your real life hands, we can't see you, so that will not help you out nearly as much as you would like it to. It might be cardiovascular exercise, but that's it. And while you are doing that, I'll say one of the things I was reminded of was the feeling in the early days of the pandemic when we were all scrambling, as was especially because of the comments you brought up about people, this is what I look like when I'm on camera and things like that. And because I have some friends who are real big NASCAR fans, I was abundantly aware that NASCAR was one of the things that stopped at the beginning of the pandemic for a while. And it occurred to me 2 or 3 weeks in that really there was a way in which the church had become a substitute, at least for NASCAR, because every Sunday morning you could go on your computer and go on screen and watch ministers crash and burn where the race cars were no longer there.
Or the musicians.
Yes.
It was a collective effort.
Yes, but there were all sorts of crashes in those early days,
Yes,
as we tried to figure it out.
Very much so.
So I'm waiting to see a hand raise. I'm seeing something in the chat. Anita, would you like to share your comment out loud? Would that be okay? I will allow you to talk. No.
Sure. What I'd like to share is that, emotions are very high, and you've really touched on so many different things, and I appreciate your talk tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm still, myself personally, I'm still dealing with performance anxiety, which has been incredible because unfortunately it's been just me as a performer. I don't do virtual choirs in my church. But I have also reached out to several people in the congregation and choir members and so forth that were members, which unfortunately I took a position right before the pandemic hit, so I don't really know them. But wow, how in the world do you reach out to people that could also be in the same boat? Performance anxiety is real. Recording and live streaming, which is so new. And here I am, a seasoned performer, and it's driving me crazy. How do you bring others on board? And I don't know if this is really the realm of this night, but it's really weighing on my mind. So thank you.
Yes, no, that's a great question. Thank you, Anita. So part of it, so in my own experience, it's been something where, there have been social media groups that have been out there, whether it's like the Facebook Organist Association or whatever, where I wasn't necessarily a part of it, but saw repeating threads, right, of people that say, I have so much anxiety about this, I've never been on camera before, how do I handle this? And you had a lot of colleagues that would step in that they've never met before, right, but they could give some kind of tip or talk about just focus on you and what you're doing. And that really came back to my push to remind people, the first few weeks of this, the choir, those who were soloists that were still felt comfortable enough doing something along these lines were very much on edge. And that's where we got to that point of, you're doing this authentically. So how would you do it normally when everybody was here? Well, but that's different. I wouldn't have been recorded. Yes, so you're being recorded now. So what you're going to do is you're going to just sing it. You're going to get through it. You can take notes and you can improve from that. And I think we really had to get to a point of seeing this as an opportunity. I know it challenged my hymn playing, and I say that as somebody who is normally quite confident in whatever it is that I'm doing, but really being able to organize those things was it was complicated. And we had our Christmas Eve service where we decided to use a full production company for it, and the 1 hour service was 10 hours worth of recording. The performance anxiety was gone because it just became performance frustration by the end of it, where everybody just wanted to go home and just wanted it to end. So there's a fine line between being comfortable and between just being frustrated. So I think social media has been a great outlet for that. And I think also being able to maintain contact with people that have been active has been helpful. I found one thing, and you might consider this too, is to reach out to other musicians that you normally don't have the opportunity to engage, either because they're doing their own thing at the same time that you would all have been normally gathered, or they're just looking to do something new. And whether it's recording things remotely and putting them together or doing something, it kind of helps ease it when there's somebody else that is there, because then you feel like, oh, well, I'm not the only one here that looks like they might not know what they're doing. We're all in this together, right? And I think that that's part of that worship experience too, is that it's not usually a solo act, and that was the real shift. So, but it's a great question, and I think that there's still many questions surrounding how to work through that.
Okay, Leanne Newland is having microphone issues, and so she did write in her question. She wanted to thank you for the presentation, but she says her question is, in regard to singing in church now, are there any new protocols being developed for in-person singing at this point?
That is all over the place. Honestly, the answer is to check with your state if you're in the United States at this point. In New York State, the current guidance that was most recently issued in February is that singing, at least congregational singing, is something that should be avoided, or if it's going to be engaged in and it's inside, everybody should be masked and at least 12 feet apart. And they really recommend not doing it inside. It should be done outside. It becomes really complicated. In our situation, as of right now, our services are recorded. We have very few people. Most of those who are working in this, I think actually everybody at this point has been vaccinated. So I usually have maybe one or two solo, choral participants in this that will sing through the hymns, right? But soon we'll be transitioning back into a hybridized form where we have people that are in person. They will watch, the video will be recorded and broadcast later. Well, that takes that ability away. For us to do it safely, we're probably going to record the song in advance and just play the recording during the service, but it's one more component. Right now, I think we're still waiting on research as far as when things will be safer. And one of the big questions we're dealing with is, let's say that, we're deciding we're definitely opening back up, but singing is still not safe. How are we going to resume the choir? We're not going to be in a position where we're asking which choir members are vaccinated and which are not, or the same for church members. So we have to operate from a level that basically assumes that nobody is vaccinated, right? And we have to do what's safest for everybody. And that's part of that accessible worship experience and part of the questions that are being asked. So I would say to at least consult your local state guidance. The CDC, I know, is still very, very much, please don't do that. And I think that's probably not going to change at this point. I'm hopeful for a possible September start, but I am fully prepared for not putting our choir back together in any semblance of what it used to be until at least 2022 at this point.
Jean Milfort, would you go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you very much for this awesome presentation. Very informative. I appreciate it. The question I'd like to ask is that I am a performer, a live musician. So I usually perform with a saxophone with a backing track. Now, to do this via Zoom, I have some hesitancies to do it on Zoom. I do some Facebook Live. I play with some equipment, but I would like to know if you have some readily tips as a veteran performer as to how to come across the video feed onto the listeners. How do you set that up to have to give a better experience to the listeners?
Thank you for your question. Thanks for being here this evening. I think the base level of this, I have found that doing live virtual music to be very complicated. And you basically have one of two options. Either one, you record everything in advance and quote, play it live, where you're just doing that. It's something where you're able to mitigate the sound. Or two, you're going to set up your environment. I know from friends that have done this, if they were doing worship by Zoom, they were setting up those segments as strictly as webinars, where they could ensure that nobody else was doing anything at the same time, because just hosting a meeting and doing mute all is not always effective. I know in our experiences, there's still one person that somehow finds the unmute button and decides to sing along with whatever is going on. And then everything goes haywire. And your perfectionist, sacred musician self just sits there in frustration and wants things to change. So I think those are the basic options, are either recording in advance so that you have some level of control over that, or doing it in a way that you can ensure that others are not doing that. My preference really is to be able to record. It depends on the type of equipment that you're using, and I'm not necessarily going to get into that as detailed information about equipment or the technical aspects of it. I think being able to, quote, control your environment is really key to being able to do that successfully. And that's what I will give you on that. But thank you for your question.
Anybody else? Any questions, comments, thoughts? There's something telling me there are hands up. Let me see Zoom. Okay, Tina Marie Bottini, go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Hi. I just wanted to say thank you. That was great. I am just a soloist, so I don't play any instruments, just my voice. And where I go to church, we have been having...
Tina, we've lost you. You muted yourself.
Oh, I don't know how I did that. We have been doing for a while, our pastors in the church, in the sanctuary, our organist, our soloist. We also have a sound tech and a camera person because we installed cameras in the sanctuary. And for those who are having, I was one of those, never thought I would get up and do a solo. But for those who are having a hard time doing that, I encourage you to just remember that you are there to sing glory to God. And whatever comes across on that camera is absolutely nothing more than that. Just your singing voice and praise to him. It's scary, but just try not to think of a camera being on you or paying attention to you.
I totally agree. And if you're somebody who is singing and you feel terrified, just assume how terrified your accompanist feels too, trying to estimate whatever it is that you're going to do. So that the nerves are mutual and the anticipation and everything is mutual. But I think if you focus on what you're doing as a missional act and of trying to provide to what Victoria Sirota said, being that mystic, right, of trying to connect these two worlds of what people are experiencing and reminding people of that grace, and certainly singing things when you don't feel comfortable about it is an entire exercise in God's grace, is really key to be able to put yourself into that position of simply doing what it is that you have come there to do, and how that's part of a much larger process. But thank you for that encouragement. I think, I have yet to tell people, please just stop in the middle of something. We focus on trying to make things better and not just pointing out those shortcomings.
Well, and something that our pianist told us the other day was, if you're going to make a mistake, make it loud so I can hear it and we can fix it together.
Yes, do it with flair. Commit. What is it? Is it Beethoven who said to play wrong notes is understandable, but to play without passion is inexcusable. So I think that's the key thing. It's make a joyful noise. It doesn't say the best noise. It's.
And it was Martin Luther who said, "Sin boldly that grace may abound." Laura Russell, go ahead and unmute and ask your question, please.
Hi, well, thank you, Justin, and thank you, James, for hosting this. There's so much to respond to. It was really, really interesting and helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Justin knows a little bit about this, but things have changed, so you don't know everything. I'm in Poughkeepsie, minister of music at an Episcopal church, where we have an excellent organist and a wonderful volunteer choir, usually between 20 and 25 singers. We have not met in person with the choir since March of 2020. We experimented with live stream worship, first with our pastor's cell phone, and then with Zoom, and now we are, and then YouTube, and now we are doing YouTube premieres every week, where everything is pre-recorded, but it premieres at the time the service used to premiere. And we've discovered some really interesting things that ways that it didn't work, and ways that we've figured out how to make it work. Just having a camera sort of panning on the whole scene in the background really got boring very quickly and didn't draw people in. So I have come to, okay. All right, there was a message in the chat I don't have to respond to, right? No, okay.
Unless you want to.
No. We've come to realize that how things translate when you're in a very different medium is a real creative challenge. We have beautiful, the building dates from 1880, and they're beautiful. It's a beautiful sort of neo-Gothic, sort of Victorian, really, and they're beautiful old stained glass windows. And so one of my roles has been to make music videos to accompany the virtual choir. And by zooming in very close and using iMovie, all the congregation is able to see the Good Shepherd window when it's Psalm 23 Sunday, and to see the detail of that window that's usually way over their heads and they can't see any of the detail of. And for me, that's kind of a metaphor about how to do things differently during the pandemic and a possible silver lining, that you get to experience worship in a very different way and things work differently. So I could go on and on, but I'll stop.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful experience, and it's a wonderful way in which to have that. And I think, back to times that I've had in churches long prior to COVID, right? If you're a sacred musician, you spend all kinds of weird hours and weird spaces, and see things that many others don't, because they're only there on those given hours, right, of when they might normally be there. And I think this has provided us with that opportunity, both musically, both aesthetically, spiritually, right, to allow those smaller moments that might normally be passed over, right, or glossed over, to let those things come out. And I think it really forced us to become very intentional in what we have done. Those that have done, I think, worship in a presentation that is well received have been very intentional, very specific about what it is that they're trying to do. The downfall to this, obviously, is that sacred musicians and clergy all of a sudden fancy themselves as film directors, and I'm looking for some kind of weird sermon interpretation of any of Godot's French cinematic pieces. Maybe that's coming soon to a denomination near you. But I think it's a wonderful experience where we can really start to get into that in a way to be intentional. You almost have a form of visual and musical exegesis, right? As far as what it is that you're trying to do, and you're really getting back to that core of what you're doing. It's not simply, I think we've all been there where you just picked an anthem because, well, I'm going to have 6 people and this doesn't sound terrible, right? But now all of a sudden that whole capability after maybe the first few weeks of COVID was changed. The dynamic was changed in a way that provided an opportunity to many and, a huge risk and liability to others. But yeah, no, that's a wonderful point. Thank you.
May I respond? Oh, I don't want to hog things here, but just to something you said about the exegesis and all. For example, during Lent, we sang a very simple, the virtual choir recorded a very simple Kyrie, which we sang. I mean, it was exactly the same for all of the weeks of Lent. And what I started to do was sort of look at all of the New Testament, the Psalm, the Old Testament, the Gospel, and sort of pull out what themes were what I thought was really important and crucial, and then find images that went with those. So if it was create in me a clean heart, or if it was, whatever it was. And so each week, the Kyrie was accompanied by visual images that teased out or illustrated the themes in the readings, and I included written music notes that labeled that, and so people would understand why they were seeing certain things. And I got amazing feedback on that, because early in the service with the Kyrie, they saw these images of themes that they would then hear read later in the service. And that was very exciting.
It is, yeah. I think all of a sudden people started to realize, wow, we did things and really coordinated. And one of the side effects of that too is, there used to be the old adage, at least among organists, that, well, I could play the same postlude, 4 weeks in a row and nobody would notice. But now it's on record and they can't get away with that. One of my colleagues discovered that at week 3, they reused something again and got an email. I think you sent the wrong file into whoever put the video, because you did that 2 weeks ago. So, like we said, it's an opportunity and it's a liability, and it's what people put into it that they're going to get out of that particular experience. Thank you.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi, how are you? I'm Brenda. I'm not a professional musician. However, I was a church organist once upon a time, and I sing in quite a few local groups. At any rate, I retired in May, having been exposed to COVID more than I would like to say. Anyway, working in the healthcare profession. With that said, I joined about 4 virtual choirs, which really, I think, saved me during this pandemic. Now, here's my question. How do we get the powers that be to recognize the importance of the sacred musician and a role in nursing homes, hospitals, perhaps to even have choirs of healthcare professionals. Now, where I come from in Pennsylvania, many, many decades ago, we did have a wonderful choir of St. Luke singers led by famous guy, Floyd Schlegel, and he just passed away during the pandemic. How would you approach maybe the powers that be to recognize the real need for sacred musicians to come out of the church into other venues?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's a good thing to explore. Off of the top of my head, someone who used to be in Albany, Joseph Epping, who was I believe the chair at one point of the College of St. Rose, has since retired and moved to Hawaii. And in his retirement, he has taken to getting his certifications to be somebody who is a hospice coordinator. And he works with the Episcopal Cathedral in Honolulu, St. Andrews. And part of the ministry that cathedral does is essentially singers that not necessarily go to nursing homes, but specifically go to families under hospice care. And this was something that was started before the pandemic. And then during the pandemic, they made an effort to try and do things specifically around that so that people would still have an experience like that. So that is somebody who, I think would be a resource to talk to or to research about what it is that they do. Epping, Eppink, Joseph. You can probably find him relatively easy on either social media or through the Cathedral of St. Andrew in Honolulu. But he is somebody who specifically worked with that and started programs up from scratch. And it was something that was very important for him and his experiences and what it was that he wanted to do going forward. So that gives you an example of that too. I know that we made a point, at least within Greenbush, that we knew not everybody in the choir could be active and participate in things, but we still wanted to create opportunities for them. And the choir actually became far more active, not in singing, but in doing things that were going to be socially active, such as doing the food drives and food distributions that were there, right? We found not necessarily musical ways in which to be a part of that. So I think one way in which you could do that is not to discount musical groups doing non-musical work and expanding through that. And then I think as well, when you talk about trying to do musical things that are related to music in groups and getting that outside of the church, I think it really requires being able to cast a vision of what music ministry is going to look like. You know, part of what we did, ironically, months before COVID, we had finished installing a new organ at Greenbush Reformed. There was one concert, we were planning a whole series of them, and it didn't necessarily happen that way with shutdowns. But by recording that digital concert that then became part and kicked off of that town-wide parade, right? I think you simply need to. It sounds easy and it's quite difficult, right? But you have to think of new ways to do things and be innovative and see where those gaps are. And I think if you can identify the gap that is there and then start to work towards a solution of how to fill that, that will be much more useful in your approach. The powers that be, as you call them, usually there's one of two concerns. Either one, well, it won't work, or two, we already do something similar to that, and that would take away that special thing from these particular groups of people. And I think trying to find where those voids are and fill them would probably be one of the most effective ways to get into that. But thank you. That's a great question, and I really hope that you're able to be successful in that, and that information helps you or helps others that are attending with some of those same concepts. Thank you.
It's a real unmet need. I really appreciate your answer. Thank you for doing this.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Okay.
I do not see any more raised hands. Oh, no. I say that, and an old classmate of mine proves me wrong. So, Maggie, would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Hi.
Hello.
Justin, thank you so much for this. And hello, James. How are you? I just wanted to comment that I know that it's been very difficult with the singing situation during the pandemic. So our church has resorted to, virtual choirs and virtual duets and things. But we have found great joy in our handbell program because it's something you can do. And we have, each ringer has their own table and their own music. And, that's the wonderful thing about handbells. And actually all 5 of our handbell choirs are rehearsing again. And, we're doing recordings to be used in worship, but we're actually doing a virtual concert on May 2nd, and we're going to record the finale outdoors so that everybody can ring together. So I just wanted to throw that out there. If any churches have handbells, it's been a really great way to, have people still be able to come masked, obviously, but, distanced safely. And, adding percussion and adding other instrumentalists, while we can't safely sing, it's been a great joy. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. That's a wonderful thought. And I know of some people that have specifically geared up and did that. I believe it was in not the South, but somewhere in the Mid-Atlantic. You had 2 or 3 churches that were trying to figure out what to do, and they basically split the cost of acquiring those 3 to 5 octaves. And out of this shutdown, they formed a community ministry of handbells. It was something safe, something that was relatively accessible for people that might not have all of the musical skills, right? But you have people that are far more comfortable in being involved in percussion or handbell choirs than maybe would sing normally. So I think the important thing is to find those opportunities where we can and really lean into that and don't simply dismiss things because, well, we've never done it before, right? It's somewhere I have a button that has that phrase because that's how we've always done it. It just has a red circle with a cross through it. And I think that same kind of mindset is really needed in situations like this. So thank you for bringing that up and reminding us of that. It's a wonderful example.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I thank everyone for being here this evening. Again, special thanks to Justin, who has been our Poppin Young Fellow for this year and has done a terrific job and given us a wonderful presentation. And I wish you all a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.